In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where life usually moved at a slow and predictable pace, Officer Daniel Grayson was known for his aggressive approach to policing. People whispered about him in coffee shops and grocery stores, how he always seemed to pull over the same types of drivers, how his tone could shift from calm to confrontational in seconds. There had been complaints before, lots of them, but nothing ever stuck. Each time someone filed a report alleging racial profiling or excessive force, the department brushed it off as routine misunderstandings. After all, Grayson had been on the force for years, and no one had managed to gather enough evidence to take him down. On this particular evening, everything started like any other night. The sun was setting, painting streaks of orange and pink across the sky. Grayson sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee while scanning the empty stretch of road ahead. It wasn't busy. Most folks were already home, settling into their routines after work. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted a car speeding slightly above the limit, a sleek sedan weaving through the lanes with ease. He squinted at the driver, catching a glimpse of dark hair tied back neatly. Without hesitation, he flipped on his sirens and signaled for the car to pull over. The driver obeyed immediately, pulling onto the shoulder without drama. As Grayson stepped out of his vehicle, flashlight in hand, he felt that familiar mix of authority and tension coursing through him. He approached the car cautiously, peering inside. Behind the wheel sat a young woman, her hands resting visibly on the steering wheel. She looked nervous but composed, her eyes wide as she waited for him to speak. "License and registration," Grayson barked, his voice sharp and commanding. The woman nodded quickly, reaching toward the center console. That's when things took a turn. As soon as Grayson heard the faint hum of music coming from the car stereo, something upbeat with a heavy bass, he frowned. His demeanor shifted instantly. "Turn that down," he snapped, leaning closer to the window. The woman hesitated for a moment, surprised by the sudden change in tone, but complied. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his gaze narrowing. "I think I might have been going a little fast," she replied softly, keeping her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I'm sorry if I broke the speed limit." Grayson didn't respond right away. Instead, he studied her face, lingering on details, the softness of her features, the way she carried herself. Something about her made him uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was the music, or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, it fueled his suspicion. "You live around here?" he asked abruptly, cutting through the silence. "Yes, not too far from here," she answered politely, trying to keep the situation light. "I'm heading home." Grayson grunted, unconvinced. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. What kind of music was that? Sounds like trouble to me. The comment caught her off guard. Her expression faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "It's just music," she said, attempting a small smile. "Nothing serious." But Grayson wasn't amused. His jaw tightened and his grip on the flashlight grew firmer. "Just music, huh? Funny how these kinds of songs always seem to come with problems." The air between them grew heavier. The woman sensed the shift in energy and tried to stay calm. She knew better than to argue with someone wearing a badge, especially when they were clearly looking for reasons to escalate the situation. Still, she couldn't help but feel frustrated. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not tonight, not to her. She decided to focus on cooperating fully, hoping it would diffuse the tension. When Grayson repeated his request for her license and registration, she carefully reached toward the glove compartment. But as her hand moved, Grayson's instincts kicked in. In his mind, every movement became a potential threat. Panic surged through him, clouding his judgment. Before she could even react, he shouted, "Stop! Don't move!" Her heart raced. As she froze mid-motion, confusion washing over her face. "I'm just getting my papers," she stammered, holding up her empty hands. But it was too late. Grayson's finger twitched on the trigger and a single gunshot rang out, shattering the stillness of the evening. Time seemed to stand still. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then, realization hit. The woman clutched her chest, gasping for breath as blood began to seep through her shirt. Grayson stumbled backward, his face pale with shock. What had just happened? Had he really fired his weapon? Over a traffic stop? By the time backup arrived, it was already too late. The young woman lay motionless on the ground, her life slipping away. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but there was nothing they could do. She was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Only later did the truth come to light. The woman wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of federal judge Evelyn Thompson, a respected figure in the legal community. Her name was Maya, and she had been an aspiring law student, full of dreams and promise. Now, those dreams were gone, stolen in an instant, because of a reckless act born out of fear and prejudice. Word spread quickly, igniting outrage across the city. Social media exploded with posts calling for justice, and protests erupted outside police headquarters. People demanded answers and accountability. How could something like this happen, and why did it keep happening to people who looked like Maya? For Grayson, the consequences were swift and severe. Dashcam footage from his patrol car revealed the horrifying sequence of events, showing how quickly the situation spiraled out of control. Viewers saw firsthand how his words and actions escalated the encounter, leaving no doubt that this tragedy could have been avoided. As the investigation unfolded, questions lingered in everyone's minds. Would this case finally break the cycle of impunity surrounding police misconduct, or would it fade away like so many others before it? One thing was certain: the lives of everyone involved, Maya's family, Grayson, and the entire community, would never be the same again. The moment the news broke, it felt like the ground beneath the city had shifted. Social media lit up with posts, videos, and hashtags, each one carrying a mix of anger, disbelief, and sorrow. People couldn't stop talking about what had happened. The image of a young woman, a law student no less, losing her life during something as routine as a traffic stop struck a deep chord. It wasn't just another headline, it was personal. For many, it was a stark reminder of how fragile life could be when power was misused. As details emerged, the story took on an even heavier weight. The victim wasn't just anyone. She was the daughter of a federal judge, someone who dedicated their life to upholding justice. Friends and colleagues described her as bright, ambitious, and kind-hearted. They spoke of her passion for fairness, her determination to make a difference in the world. She had dreams of becoming a judge herself someday, following in her mother's footsteps. But now those dreams were gone, cut short in the most senseless way imaginable. Her family was devastated. Her mother, the judge, retreated from public view, overwhelmed by grief. Close friends said she barely left her house, spending hours staring at old photos of her daughter or sitting quietly in her study. Neighbors brought meals over, but she barely touched them. Every knock on the door reminded her of the emptiness inside. The loss wasn't just painful, it was paralyzing. How do you move forward when the person you love most is suddenly taken away? Meanwhile, the community erupted in outrage. Protesters filled the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice for her and no more excuses." Their voices echoed through neighborhoods, demanding accountability not just for this case, but for all the others that never made headlines. Parents brought their children to marches, explaining why standing up mattered. Students organized vigils on college campuses, lighting candles and sharing stories of similar encounters with law enforcement. It wasn't just about one tragic incident anymore. It was about a pattern, a system that seemed rigged against certain groups of people. At the center of the storm stood Officer Grayson. His name became synonymous with controversy overnight. While some defended him, claiming he acted out of fear, the majority turned against him. Dashcam footage released by the police department painted a damning picture. Viewers saw how quickly the situation escalated, how unnecessary force replaced basic communication. Comments poured in online, dissecting his every word and action. Many pointed out moments where things could have gone differently, if only. Patience had replaced aggression, if only empathy had guided the interaction instead of suspicion. For Grayson, the backlash was overwhelming. He went from being a relatively unknown officer to the face of police misconduct. Reporters camped outside his home, shoving microphones toward him whenever he stepped outside. Anonymous threats flooded his inbox, forcing him to disconnect from social media altogether. His colleagues at the station avoided eye contact, unsure whether to offer support or distance themselves. Even his own family struggled to process what had happened. His wife stopped answering calls from curious neighbors, while his kids faced awkward questions at school. Life as they knew it unraveled before their eyes. Amidst the chaos, Internal Affairs launched an investigation into Grayson's past conduct. What they uncovered shocked even those who disliked him. Dozens of individuals came forward with stories of harassment, intimidation, and racial profiling. Some recounted being pulled over repeatedly for minor infractions, only to be let go without explanation. Others described tense encounters where Grayson's tone turned hostile within seconds. One man tearfully recalled how his teenage son had been handcuffed and searched during a routine stop, leaving the boy traumatized for months afterward. Each testimony added fuel to the fire. Civil rights organizations joined the chorus of voices, calling for accountability, urging prosecutors to pursue federal charges. Legal experts weighed in, debating whether this case qualified as a hate crime. Never before had a police officer faced such severe consequences for a single incident. Critics argued that charging him under these statutes set a dangerous precedent, while supporters insisted it was long overdue. Either way, everyone agreed. Whatever happened next would send a powerful message. Behind closed doors, discussions grew heated. Lawmakers debated reforms aimed at preventing future tragedies. Community leaders called for increased transparency within law enforcement, pushing for body cameras and stricter oversight. Activists demanded more than apologies. They wanted action. Change wasn't going to come easily, but the momentum was undeniable. For the victim's family, the fight for justice became both a burden and a mission. Her mother, though heartbroken, refused to let her daughter's death be forgotten. With the help of attorneys specializing in civil rights cases, she filed a lawsuit against the department, seeking answers and accountability. She also began speaking publicly, sharing her pain in hopes of inspiring change. At rallies and press conferences, her voice trembled with emotion, yet remained resolute. "This shouldn't happen to anyone," she said, choking back tears. "Not my child, not yours." Her words resonated deeply. People listened, not because she was a judge, but because she was a mother. They saw themselves in her grief, imagined their own families torn apart by similar circumstances. And so they rallied behind her, vowing to keep fighting until real progress was made. Back at the station, morale plummeted. Officers walked on eggshells, aware that the entire country was watching. Some expressed frustration, arguing that Grayson's actions didn't reflect the values of the force. Others admitted privately that his behavior had always raised red flags. Training sessions were scheduled, policies reviewed, and promises made to rebuild trust with the community. But skepticism lingered. Could meaningful change truly happen, or would this fade away once the spotlight moved elsewhere? As days turned into weeks, the case continued to dominate conversations everywhere. Late-night talk shows featured heated debates about policing and racism. Podcasts analyzed every angle of the story, from legal implications to societal impacts. Documentaries began production, aiming to capture the complexity of the situation. Everywhere you looked, people were talking and thinking about what needed to change. Through it all, one question lingered. Would this tragedy lead to lasting reform, or would it simply become another chapter in a long history of injustice? Only time would tell, but for now the nation held its breath, waiting to see how the wheels of justice would turn, and hoping, desperately, that they would finally move in the right direction. The investigation into the shooting deepened as days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted on everyone involved. For Officer Grayson, life had become a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Once a figure of authority in his uniform, he now found himself at the center of a storm that showed no signs of calming. Every move he made was scrutinized, every word dissected. Even within the police department, where loyalty often ran thick, He felt isolated. His colleagues avoided him in the hallways, and when they did speak, it was with stiff formality, as if they were afraid their words might be used against them later. Outside the station, public outrage continued to grow. Protesters gathered daily, their chants echoing through the streets. Justice now. Enough is enough. The community had reached its breaking point. Years of frustration over systemic issues boiled over, fueled by this one devastating incident. It wasn't just about what happened to the young woman anymore. It was about all the other lives lost, all the other families torn apart by similar acts of negligence or prejudice. People wanted answers, but more than that, they wanted change. For the victim's family, the pain was still raw. Her mother, the judge, tried to keep her composure, but anyone who saw her could tell how much she was struggling. She attended meetings with lawyers, gave interviews to reporters, and spoke at rallies, but behind closed doors she was falling apart. Friends said she spent hours staring at old photos, replaying memories in her mind. How could someone so full of life be gone? Why did it have to happen this way? Her daughter's death weighed heavily on her, not just as a parent, but also as someone who had devoted her career to justice. She couldn't help but feel like the system she believed in had failed, not just her family, but countless others like hers. This realization pushed her to take action. With the support of civil rights attorneys, she decided to pursue federal charges against Grayson under hate crime statutes. It was an unprecedented move, and it sent shockwaves through the legal world. Never before had a police officer faced such severe charges for a single incident. Prosecutors threw themselves into building the case, determined to leave no stone unturned. They pored over dashcam footage, frame by frame, analyzing every second of the encounter. Expert witnesses were called in to testify about policing practices, racial bias, and the use of excessive force. Social media posts from Grayson's personal accounts surfaced, revealing troubling patterns of behavior. Inflammatory comments, memes mocking marginalized communities, and even private messages boasting about teaching lessons during traffic stops painted a disturbing picture of the man behind the badge. Defense attorneys fought back fiercely, arguing that Grayson's actions were a tragic mistake rather than a deliberate act of malice. They pointed to his years of service, claiming he was being unfairly scapegoated for a single lapse in judgment. They highlighted moments in the dashcam video where the victim reached toward the glove compartment, suggesting it could have reasonably been perceived as a threat. But these arguments fell flat for many people watching closely. To them, it didn't matter whether Grayson intended harm or not. What mattered was the culture of fear and aggression that allowed such a tragedy to occur in the first place. As the case unfolded, tensions simmered on both sides. Supporters of law enforcement rallied around Grayson, insisting he deserved leniency. They argued that policing was a difficult job, and officers shouldn't be punished too harshly for split-second decisions made under pressure. On the flip side, activists doubled down on their calls for accountability, reminding everyone that mistakes like this had real consequences that disproportionately affected certain groups of people. In the middle of it all stood the victim's family, caught between grief and determination. Her mother knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Pushing for federal charges meant going up against powerful institutions, including the police union and parts of the legal system itself. But she refused to back down. This wasn't just about her daughter anymore. It was about sending a message that no one, not even those sworn to protect and serve, was above the law. Public opinion remained divided. Some sympathized with Grayson, believing he acted out of panic rather than hatred. Others saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with modern policing, a reminder of how easily bias could seep into everyday interactions and escalate into something deadly. News outlets covered the debate extensively, airing interviews with experts, activists, and ordinary citizens sharing their thoughts. Talk shows hosted heated discussions, while social media threads exploded with conflicting viewpoints. Everyone had an opinion and everyone wanted to be heard. Meanwhile, Grayson's life unraveled further. Stripped of his badge pending trial, he struggled to find work. Anonymous threats poured in daily, forcing him to move his family multiple times for safety. His wife stopped answering questions from curious neighbors, and his kids withdrew from friends at school. embarrassed by the attention. The weight of guilt pressed down on him too, though he rarely spoke about it publicly. In rare moments of reflection, he admitted to close friends that he wished he could turn back time. But whether he truly regretted his actions or simply regretted getting caught remained unclear. Amidst the chaos, small steps toward reform began to emerge. Lawmakers proposed bills aimed at increasing accountability within law enforcement, including mandatory body cameras and stricter penalties for misconduct. Community leaders organized town halls, inviting residents to share their experiences and ideas for change. Activists launched campaigns to educate the public about racial profiling and the importance of de-escalation training for officers. These efforts weren't perfect and progress felt painfully slow, but they offered a glimmer of hope. For the victim's family, hope came in different forms. Friends and supporters flooded them with love and encouragement, helping them navigate the darkest days. Memorials popped up across the city, honoring her memory and celebrating the impact she'd had on those around her. Scholarships were established in her name, supporting students pursuing careers in law and social justice. Her mother found solace in these tributes, knowing her daughter's legacy would live on in meaningful ways. Yet, despite these efforts, the question lingered: would justice truly be served? As the trial approached, anticipation grew. People lined up outside courthouses eager to catch a glimpse of the proceedings. Journalists camped out nearby, ready to report every twist and turn. The nation watched closely, waiting to see if this case would mark a turning point, or if it would fade away like so many others before it. For the victim's family, the fight wasn't just about punishment. It was about recognition. Recognition of the pain caused by unchecked power. Recognition of the lives lost to preventable tragedies, and recognition that true justice required more than convictions. It required transformation. Only then could they begin to heal, and only then could society start moving toward a future where stories like theirs didn't repeat themselves. The trial began on a crisp morning, the kind where the air feels heavy with anticipation. Reporters lined up outside the courthouse hours before proceedings were set to start, their cameras clicking away as spectators trickled in. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. Seats filled quickly, and those who couldn't find space stood along the walls or craned their necks from the back. For weeks leading up to this day, people had debated what might happen, what should happen, and now finally, they were about to witness history unfold. Officer Grayson sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. He wore a suit instead of his usual uniform, but it did little to soften his appearance. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through papers, though he tried hard to appear calm. Across the aisle, the prosecution team worked quietly, organizing files and whispering among themselves. The victim's family occupied the front row, her mother sitting stoically despite the visible weight of grief etched into her features. Friends, activists, and community members filled the rest of the room, each person carrying their own reasons for being there. As the judge entered and called the court to order, a hush fell over the crowd. Opening statements began, setting the tone for what promised to be an emotional and contentious battle. The prosecutor painted a vivid picture of the events that led to the young woman's death, emphasizing how easily the situation could have been resolved without violence. This wasn't self-defense, they argued passionately. This was a reckless act born out of bias and poor judgment, a pattern we've seen far too often. They presented evidence meticulously, starting with the dashcam footage. The video, played on a large screen, freezing at key moments to highlight Grayson's escalating behavior. Viewers watched as his tone shifted from professional to confrontational, as his body language grew more aggressive. When the fatal shot rang out, you could hear gasps ripple through the courtroom. Even those who had seen the clip before couldn't help but react. It was impossible not to feel the raw emotion of that moment. Next came witness testimonies. First were the bystanders who happened to drive by that night, describing the chaos they witnessed. One recounted seeing Grayson shouting commands. Another recalled hearing the gunshot and rushing to check if anyone needed help. Their accounts added layers to the story, reinforcing the idea that the shooting was unnecessary and avoidable. Then came individuals who had interacted with Grayson in the past, sharing stories of similar encounters that ended with threats or intimidation. Each testimony chipped away at the defense's argument that this was an isolated incident. Expert witnesses took the stand next, offering insights into policing practices and racial bias. A psychologist explained how implicit biases can influence split-second decisions, while a former officer discussed the importance of de-escalation techniques. These experts didn't mince words. They made it clear that Grayson's actions deviated sharply from accepted protocols. For many in the courtroom, these explanations provided clarity, helping them understand why the case resonated so deeply with marginalized communities. The defense countered fiercely, presenting its own narrative. Grayson's attorney argued that he acted out of fear, believing his life was in danger when the victim reached toward the glove compartment. They highlighted moments in the dashcam footage where her movement could have reasonably been perceived as threatening, urging jurors to consider the pressure officers face during high-stakes situations. Witnesses testified about Grayson's character, describing him as dedicated and well-meaning, though some struggled to maintain eye contact as they spoke. Throughout the trial, emotions ran high. There were moments when voices cracked, tears spilled, and tempers flared. During cross-examinations, tensions simmered as lawyers challenged each other's arguments. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, hanging on to every word. Outside the courtroom, protests continued, with demonstrators holding signs and chanting slogans demanding accountability. Media coverage intensified, with news outlets broadcasting live updates and airing interviews with legal analysts breaking down the complexities of the case. For Grayson, the trial felt like a never-ending nightmare. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, seemed designed to strip away whatever dignity he had left. He avoided making eye contact with the victim's family, unable to bear the weight of their pain. At times, he buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. His wife attended sporadically, sitting silently in the back, her expression unreadable. It was clear that the toll of the trial extended beyond the courtroom. It was fracturing lives. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments arrived. Both sides gave impassioned speeches, leaving no doubt about the stakes involved. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the bigger picture, the systemic issues that allowed such tragedies to occur, and the need for accountability. This isn't just about one man, they said. It's about sending a message that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. The defense, meanwhile, implored the jury to consider context and intent. They reminded everyone that Grayson hadn't set out to harm anyone. He had simply made a mistake, a terrible, tragic mistake. Punishing him won't bring her back, they argued, but giving him a second chance might prevent others from making the same error. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the atmosphere shifted, the courtroom emptied, and reporters camped outside waiting for news. Days passed and speculation swirled. Would the verdict reflect the outrage of the public? Or would it echo the frustrations of those who felt justice rarely aligned with accountability? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. As the foreperson stood to deliver the decision, the room fell silent. Everyone held their breath, bracing for the outcome. When the words "guilty on all counts" rang out, the reaction was immediate. Gasps turned into cheers, sobs into applause. Some hugged, others cried openly. For the victim's family, it was a moment of vindication, but also bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the loss they endured. Grayson slumped in his chair, visibly shaken. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering something inaudible. Cameras flashed as deputies escorted him out of the courtroom, marking the end of a chapter but not the story itself. Outside, crowds erupted in celebration, holding signs that read, "Accountability matters," and "Justice wins." Social media lit up with reactions as people around the country weighed in on the verdict's significance. For the victim's mother, the verdict brought a mix of relief and resolve. She knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. True justice required more than convictions. It demanded change. As she addressed reporters later that day, her voice steady despite her tears, she spoke directly to the crowd. "This victory belongs to my daughter," she said, "but it also belongs to everyone who has ever felt powerless against injustice. Let this be the beginning of something better." And so, as the dust settled and the world moved on, the ripple effects of the trial lingered. Conversations about policing, accountability, and reform gained new urgency. Activists pushed harder for policy changes, lawmakers introduced bills aimed at addressing systemic issues, and communities rallied together to ensure that stories like this one didn't repeat themselves. The road ahead remained long, but for the first time in a while there was hope, a fragile, flickering light guiding the way forward. The sentencing hearing arrived on a gray, overcast morning, the kind that seemed to mirror the heaviness of the moment. The courtroom was packed once again, with every seat occupied and some people standing along the walls. Reporters jotted down notes furiously, their pens scratching against notepads as they prepared for what many were calling a historic day. This wasn't just another legal proceeding, it was a reckoning, one that carried implications far beyond the individuals directly involved. Officer Grayson sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. His suit hung loosely on him now, as if he'd lost weight since the trial began. He stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially the victim's family sitting just a few feet away. They had been there every step of the way, enduring the grueling process of reliving their loss in excruciating detail. Today, they braced themselves for what might be the final chapter of this painful saga. Before the judge delivered the sentence, both sides were given an opportunity to speak. First up was the prosecution, who reminded the court of the gravity of the crime. "This isn't just about one bad decision," the prosecutor said, his voice firm but measured. "It's about a pattern of behavior that has no place in law, enforcement, or in any society that values human life. The message we send today will resonate far beyond these walls." Then came statements from members of the public, family, friends, and community leaders who wanted their voices heard. One by one, they approached the podium, each sharing how the tragedy had impacted them personally. A childhood friend of the key victim spoke first, her voice trembling as she described the young woman's kindness and ambition. "She was going to change the world," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And now, because of one man's actions, we'll never get to see what she could have done." Next was her mother, the judge. She stood slowly, clutching a piece of paper in her hands. For a moment, she simply looked out at the room, taking in the faces of those gathered. Then she began to speak, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I don't stand here today seeking revenge," she said. "I stand here hoping for accountability, not just for my daughter, but for all the others who have suffered because of unchecked power. If we want to prevent tragedies like this, we must hold ourselves, and those in positions of authority, to a higher standard." Her words struck a chord with everyone present. Even the bailiffs and court staff paused, listening intently. When she finished, the room erupted in quiet applause, a rare occurrence in such a formal setting. It was clear that her speech resonated deeply, not just with those in attendance, but with the broader community watching online or through news coverage. Finally, it was Grayson's turn to address the court. His attorney nudged him gently, urging him to stand. He rose hesitantly, gripping the edge of the table for support. For several seconds, he said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his words halting. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I regret it more than anything." But something about his apology felt incomplete. He stopped short of acknowledging the role bias may have played in his actions, leaving many in the room feeling unsatisfied. Still, he continued, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment, "I hope someday you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." When he sat back down, the tension in the room was palpable. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others exchanged knowing glances. Whether his apology was genuine or simply calculated remained unclear. What mattered most now was the judge's decision. As the presiding judge prepared to deliver the sentence, the courtroom fell silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers, but otherwise it was eerily still. Everyone leaned forward slightly, waiting for the verdict that would define this case for generations to come. "This is not a decision I take lightly," the judge began, his tone deliberate and solemn. "What happened here was not an accident, in the truest sense of the word. It was the result of choices rooted in fear, bias, and poor judgment, choices that cost an innocent young woman her life." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "For decades, our justice system has struggled to hold law enforcement accountable when they misuse their power. Today, we draw a line in the sand. We say, enough is enough." With that, he announced the sentence: 40 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps filled the room, followed by murmurs of shock and disbelief. It was one of the harshest penalties ever handed down to a police officer in modern history. For the victim's family, the sentence brought a mix of emotions. Relief washed over them, knowing that the person responsible would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But it was also bittersweet. No amount of punishment could bring their loved one back. Her mother closed her eyes briefly, exhaling deeply as tears streamed down her cheeks. Friends reached out to comfort her, offering hugs and whispered words of support. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Protesters cheered, chanting slogans like "Justice served" and "No more excuses." Supporters held signs, bearing the victim's photo, celebrating the outcome as a victory not just for her family, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against systemic injustice. Media outlets scrambled to capture the scene, broadcasting live updates to audiences around the country. Not everyone agreed with the severity of the sentence, however. Police unions condemned the ruling, arguing that it set a dangerous precedent. Officers across the nation expressed concern, fearing it might discourage them from making tough decisions in high-pressure situations. "We're not saying he shouldn't be punished," one union representative told reporters. "But this feels extreme. Where do we draw the line between accountability and fairness?" Despite the backlash, many saw the sentence as long overdue. Activists hailed it as a turning point, proof that the tide was finally shifting toward greater accountability. Lawmakers seized the momentum, introducing bills aimed at reforming policing practices and increasing oversight. Community leaders organized workshops and training sessions focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense of hope, a fragile, flickering light guiding the way forward. As for Grayson, the road ahead promised to be bleak. Stripped of his badge and freedom, he entered federal custody shortly after the hearing. Inmates often treated former officers harshly, and Grayson quickly became a target of ridicule and hostility. Letters poured in daily, some condemning him, others expressing sympathy, but none offering solace. Life inside was lonely, isolating, and unforgiving. Back in the outside world, the victim's family worked tirelessly to honor her memory. Her mother founded a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating racial bias in law enforcement and supporting victims of police violence. The initiative gained traction quickly, attracting donations and volunteers eager to make a difference. Scholarships were established in her name, helping aspiring law students pursue careers in social justice. Murals popped up in neighborhoods across the city, vibrant reminders of the impact she had on those around her. Through it all, conversations about policing and accountability continued to evolve. People debated the merits of the sentence, questioning whether it went too far or not far enough. But one thing was certain: the case had sparked a national dialogue, one that refused to fade quietly into the background. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but progress often starts with a single step. And for the victim's family, that step felt like a meaningful beginning. As the months passed, the story gradually faded from headlines, replaced by newer events demanding attention. But its legacy endured. Every time someone mentioned the need for reform, Every time a community rallied together to demand justice, echoes of this case lingered. It served as a reminder of the human cost of prejudice and the urgent need for transformation. For those who knew her best, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Months turned into years, and life for everyone touched by the case continued to evolve in ways both expected and surprising. For Officer Grayson, now an inmate serving a 40-year sentence without parole, the days stretched endlessly. Prison was harsh, and his identity as a former cop made him a target among fellow inmates. He spent much of his time alone, reflecting on the choices that brought him there. In rare interviews granted to journalists who managed to secure access, he admitted regret, but stopped short of taking full responsibility. "I didn't wake up that day wanting to hurt anyone," he said during one such interview, his voice weary. "But I know I messed up big time." His words carried little weight with those who had followed the case closely. To them, it wasn't just about intent, it was about accountability. The system had finally held someone responsible, and for many that felt like progress. Still, some wondered if locking him away would truly address the deeper issues at play. Was this justice, or merely punishment? The debate raged on, even as the public moved on to new headlines. For the victim's family, healing remained a slow and painful process. Her mother poured herself into advocacy work, determined to channel her grief into meaningful change. She traveled across the country speaking at conferences, rallies, and community events. Her speeches were raw and heartfelt, often leaving audiences in tears. "We can't bring her back," she would say, her voice steady despite the pain etched on her face. "But we can honor her memory by making sure no other family has to go through what we did." The nonprofit organization she founded became a beacon of hope for countless families affected by police misconduct. It provided legal support, counseling services, and educational resources aimed at fostering dialogue between communities and law enforcement. Scholarships set up in her daughter's name helped aspiring lawyers pursue careers in civil rights law, ensuring that her legacy lived on through their efforts. Murals painted in neighborhoods around the city served as vibrant reminders of the young woman's impact, a bright light extinguished far too soon. As time went on, the case sparked broader conversations about systemic reform. Lawmakers introduced legislation requiring mandatory bias training for officers, increased oversight of police departments, and stricter penalties for misconduct. Some argued these measures didn't go far enough, while others worried they might hinder effective policing. But one thing was clear: the conversation had shifted. People were no longer willing to accept the status quo. Change, however incremental, was happening. In schools and universities, the story became a focal point for discussions about race, power, and accountability. Professors incorporated it into curriculums, challenging students to think critically about how society addressed or failed to address issues of injustice. Young activists drew inspiration from the case, organizing protests and campaigns aimed at pushing for further reforms. Social media played a pivotal role, amplifying voices that might otherwise have gone unheard. Hashtags created in memory of the victim trended regularly, keeping her story alive in the collective consciousness. For the victim's friends and loved ones, remembering her meant celebrating the person she was, rather than focusing solely on how she died. They organized annual memorial events, inviting people to share stories about her kindness, humor, and determination. At one gathering, a childhood friend recalled how she used to tutor classmates after school, patiently explaining concepts until everyone understood. Another remembered her infectious laugh and the way she lit up every room she entered. These moments of joy stood in stark contrast to the tragedy that defined her final chapter, offering a more complete picture of who she was. Even within the police department where Grayson once worked, changes began to take root. New leadership implemented policies designed to rebuild trust with the community. Officers attended workshops on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, learning to approach situations with empathy rather than aggression. Body cameras became mandatory, and footage was reviewed regularly to ensure compliance with protocols. While skepticism lingered, especially among critics who doubted the sincerity of these efforts, there was a growing recognition that something had to change, and that change started with accountability. As the years passed, the ripple effects of the case continued to spread. Documentaries explored its impact, weaving together interviews with experts, activists, and those directly involved. Podcasts dissected the legal proceedings, analyzing what the verdict meant for future cases involving law enforcement. Artists created works inspired by the story, using music, poetry, and visual art to capture its emotional weight. Each interpretation added another layer to the narrative, reminding people that this wasn't just a single event. It was part of a larger reckoning. For the victim's mother, the journey was far from over. Though she found solace in her advocacy, work, the absence of her daughter never faded. On quiet nights, she would sit in her study surrounded by photos and mementos, allowing herself to grieve fully. But even in her darkest moments, she clung to the belief that her daughter's death could lead to something greater. Justice isn't just about punishment, she often said. It's about transformation, for individuals, for systems, for society as a whole. Her words resonated deeply with those who heard them. They reminded people that true justice required more than convictions. It demanded action. It meant addressing the root causes of inequality and bias, creating spaces where everyone felt safe and valued. It meant listening to marginalized voices and amplifying their calls for change. And above all, it meant refusing to let tragedies like this fade into obscurity. Years later, when people looked back on the case, they saw it not just as a moment of reckoning, but as a catalyst for progress. It forced uncomfortable conversations, challenged long-held beliefs, and inspired countless individuals to take a stand. The road ahead remained long, fraught with challenges and setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope, a fragile yet unyielding light guiding the way forward. And so the memory of the young woman endured, not as a symbol of loss, but as a testament to resilience. Her story served as a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable pain, humanity has the capacity to rise, to heal, and to transform. For her family, for her community, and for generations to come, she would always be more than a headline. She would be a legacy, a call to action, a beacon of hope, and a promise that her voice would never be silenced.